The realtor called it a fixer-upper. But Carol and I had heard that word enough times in our search to know it meant the house was honest about what it was. The farmhouse outside Bristol sat on 11 acres of overgrown pasture that ran up against the tree line of the Cherokee foothills. And the first time we walked the property, I felt something settle in my chest that I'd been missing for years in the city. Quiet. Real quiet. The kind that has texture to it, that presses against your ears when you stand still in a field at dusk. Carol cried a little when we signed the papers. We were both past 50 by then, our kids grown and scattered, and this was meant to be the place where we got old together slowly, the way people used to. Our nearest neighbor lived a quarter-mile down the gravel road in a clapboard house that leaned a few degrees off true, as if the hill beneath it had grown tired of holding it level. His name was Earl. We met him our second day there. When he came walking up the road with his hands in his overall pockets and stood at the edge of our drive until I noticed him and came out. He was a thin man, maybe 65, with skin like a dried apple and pale eyes that didn't quite hold still. He welcomed us to the holler in a soft, courteous voice, said he'd lived down there his whole life and his daddy before him. When Carol brought him a glass of sweet tea, he took it but didn't drink, just held it and looked up past us at the house, at the second-floor windows, his lips pressed thin. I thought nothing of it then. An old man, a little odd from years of solitude. The mountains are full of men like that, men who've spent so long with no company but their own thoughts that the thoughts have grown teeth. It was about a week later that I first saw him standing at the edge of our property at dusk. There's a particular spot where the old fence line meets a stand of black walnut trees, maybe 40 yards from the house. And that's where he was, motionless, facing us. I waved from the porch. He didn't wave back. He wasn't looking at me. His head was tilted up and his eyes were moving in small, careful jumps across the front of the house, and his lips were moving too. I told Carol about it that night, and she said he was probably just admiring the place, that the previous owners had let it go, and maybe he liked seeing it cared for again. That was the kind of thing, Carol said. She found the gentle explanation for everything, and I loved her for it, even when it left her unguarded. But he came back the next evening, and the one after that, always at the same hour, that blue half-light when the sun's gone behind the ridge, but the dark hasn't fully come. Always the same spot, always looking up at the windows, not at us, never at us, even when we were standing right there in plain view. On the fourth or fifth evening, I got curious in a way I couldn't shake, so I went inside and stood behind the curtain in the front room and watched him through the gap. And that's when I understood what his lips were doing. He was counting. I could see the small movements, the pauses, the way his chin dipped slightly with each number. He was counting something on the face of the house, his gaze tracking from window to window, top floor to bottom, and then starting over. I counted along with him under my breath, trying to match his rhythm, and the number he seemed to be reaching over and over was 9. There are 9 windows on the front of that house. I told myself that was all it was. He was counting the windows, a harmless tick. But there's a difference between a fact being harmless and it feeling harmless. And standing there behind that curtain, watching a stranger tally my home in the failing light, I felt the back of my neck go cold. The next day I drove into town for hinges and a box of screws, and at the hardware store, I asked the man behind the counter if he knew Earl, down off the Caldwell Road. The man was maybe 40, friendly enough, but the name landed on him like a cold hand. He stopped ringing up my order. He asked which house I'd bought, and when I told him, he looked at me for a long moment and then said, careful and low, that the folks who'd owned it before us had left in a hurry. I asked what he meant by a hurry. He said they'd put it on the market in the dead of winter, and were gone inside a month, and that they'd left most of their furniture behind, didn't even come back for it. We'd wondered about that, Carol and I. The place had come with a dining set, 2 beds, a wardrobe full of mothballed coats. The realtor had said the owners were motivated. The hardware man didn't say anything else about Earl. He just told me to take care up there. And the way he said it stayed with me the whole drive home, the gravel ticking under my tires, the trees crowding closer, the deeper into the holler I went. That night I woke a little after 2 to a sound I couldn't place at first, a soft tapping. Patient, evenly spaced, like a fingernail on glass. Tap, tap, tap. I lay there in the dark with Carol breathing beside me, and the sound was coming from the window. Our bedroom is on the 2nd floor. There is nothing beneath that window but a sheer drop of 15 feet to the bare ground. No porch roof, no trellis, no tree close enough to reach. I told myself it was a branch, even knowing there was no branch, and finally, I made myself sit up and turn toward the glass. Earl's face was on the other side of it. I have tried many times since to describe what that did to me, and I have never found the words that carry the full weight of it. He was smiling, not a friendly smile, a stretched, eager thing, his pale eyes wide and fixed on me through the glass, his face floating there, 15 feet above the ground, as calmly as if he were standing on solid earth. And as I stared at him, frozen, unable to make a sound, he lifted one hand into view and showed me his fingers. 4. He held up 4 fingers. Then slowly, deliberately, he folded one down. 3. Then another, 2. He was still smiling. I came off the bed shouting, and Carol woke screaming, and by the time I'd wrenched the window up and leaned out into the cold night air, there was nothing there. No ladder, no man. Just the dark field sloping away toward the trees, and the sound of my own blood in my ears. I went down and out into the yard with a flashlight, my bare feet freezing in the dew-wet grass, and I made my circuit of the house, with my heart slamming, expecting at every corner to find him. I found nothing, but the grass was heavy with dew that night, and dew holds a track the way fresh snow does. And when I shone the light along the side of the house beneath our window, I saw footprints. They were pressed deep, an old man's narrow boots, and they led from the tree line straight to the wall beneath our window. They did not lead away. They came to the house and they stopped right at the foundation, as if whoever made them had walked up to the wall and simply gone up it. I stood there a long time, looking at those tracks until the cold drove me back inside, and I did not sleep again that night, and neither did Carol. We did what people do. We told ourselves there had to be a way, that he'd used a ladder and carried it off, that the tracks were ours from earlier. That fear had stretched the whole thing out of shape in our memory. And we acted, because acting is how you keep the fear from swallowing you whole. I drove back to town and bought new locks for every door, and the kind of motion lights that flood a whole yard white, and I mounted them on every corner of the house, working until dark with my hands shaking. That evening Earl appeared at his usual spot, by the walnut trees, counting, and when I switched the floodlights on and lit him up, like high noon, he did not flinch, did not shield his eyes, did not so much as blink. He just kept counting. And then he turned and walked back into the trees, and the lights tracked his shape until the woods took him. The tapping came again that night, and every night after. We'd lie awake waiting for it, and it always came, that patient, tap, tap, tap at the 2nd floor glass, and every night when I forced myself to look he was there, smiling, holding up his hand. And every night the number was lower than the night before. The locks meant nothing to him. The lights meant nothing. He never tried the doors. He only came to the window, and he only counted, and he only showed me how much was left. I stopped sleeping. Carol stopped eating. We talked about calling the sheriff, and we did once, and a tired deputy came out and walked the property in the daylight, and found nothing, and clearly thought we were two soft city people frightened by the woods. And I couldn't blame him, because in the daylight, with the birds going and the sun on the fields, I half believed it myself. But the daylight always ended. I went down to Earl's house once in the brightness of noon when my fear had curdled into a kind of furious nerve. I beat on his door and got no answer. I looked in the windows. There was no electricity, I could tell that much. No lamp, no hum of a refrigerator, only dust lying thick and gray over everything, over a kitchen table, and a single chair, and a calendar on the wall, so old the paper had yellowed to the color of bone. The calendar was from a year more than 3 decades gone. Nobody had lived in that house in a very long time. I drove home with my hands cold on the wheel, and I did not tell Carol what I'd seen, because there was no shape to put it in that would let either of us keep our minds. The last night, the tapping woke me, and I looked, the way I always looked, because I could not stop myself. Earl was at the glass, smiling, and he raised his hand, and there was one finger left, just the one, pointing up at the dark sky. And then, for the first time in all those nights, he spoke. His voice came through the window glass, as clear and soft as if there were nothing between us, and he said, "Almost time for the new ones to be counted." Then he was gone. We didn't pack. We left the furniture and the mothballed coats and the dining set, just like the people before us had, and we drove out of that holler before the sun was fully up, with whatever we could carry thrown in the back of the truck. I have never gone back. The realtor handled the sale long distance, and I never asked who bought it, and I have made a point all these years of not finding out. But I think about it. I think about a young couple, maybe, signing papers, and feeling that good quiet settle in their chests, carrying boxes up to a second-floor bedroom, never once wondering why the last people left in such a hurry, never knowing that down the road in a dusty house where no one has lived in 30 years, an old man with pale eyes is already standing at the tree line, in the blue dusk, looking up at their windows, beginning again at 9. The divorce had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit. And when the lease came up on the little rental near the Tennessee line, I thought a small town might be the kind of place where a person could put herself back together quietly. The house was nothing special, a single-story rental with a sagging carport and a yard that hadn't been mowed in a while, sitting at the end of a road that climbed up toward the wooded ridges. But it was cheap, and it was mine, and after 23 years of someone else's footsteps in the next room, the solitude felt less like loneliness and more like air. I had it in my head that I'd plant a garden, learn to bake, become one of those women who knows the names of birds. I'd been there less than a day, still surrounded by unopened boxes, when the woman next door came up my walk, with a pie held out in both hands. Her name was Miss Lorna, she told me, and she'd lived in the house beside mine for longer than she cared to count. She was elderly, small and bird-boned, with white hair pinned up neat, and a cardigan buttoned to the throat despite the warmth of the day. The pie was apple, still warm, and she smiled at me the whole time she spoke, a soft grandmother's smile that made my throat tighten unexpectedly. I hadn't realized how badly I'd needed someone to be kind to me. We sat on my porch steps, and she told me a little about the town, which families had been there forever, and which roads flooded in spring. And when she left, she patted my hand and said how glad she was to have a neighbor again. I watched her walk back across the strip of grass between our houses, slow and careful, and I went to bed that night, feeling, for the first time in months, that things might genuinely be all right. The knocking started that same night, a little after midnight. I was a light sleeper by then. The divorce had done that too, and the sound brought me straight up out of the dark. 3 soft raps at the front door. When I opened it, Miss Lorna was standing on my step, dressed as neatly as she had been that afternoon, her hair pinned, a touch of lipstick on, asking in the gentlest voice if she might borrow a cup of sugar. She was so apologetic about the hour, said she'd run short and couldn't sleep for thinking about it, and what was I going to do, turn away a sweet old woman? I gave her the sugar. She thanked me and shuffled off into the dark, and I went back to bed and told myself it was nothing. That old people kept strange hours, that I had done a small kindness, and that was the whole of it. But she came the next night too, at the same hour, for a cup of flour, and the night after that for a single egg. Always midnight. Always dressed, always pinned and painted, as if she'd been sitting up waiting for the clock to turn. I am ashamed to say how long I kept answering. Loneliness makes you forgiving of strangeness. I'd hear those 3 soft raps and feel my heart sink, but I'd get up anyway, because she was old and alone, and so was I. And refusing her felt like refusing the only company I had. It was somewhere in the 2nd week that I started keeping a tally, more out of bafflement than fear. I realized she had never once returned anything. Not a cup, not a bowl, not a thing. And stranger still, in all those midnight visits, I had never seen any sign that she used what she took. No smell of baking ever drifted from her windows. No light ever burned in her kitchen at that hour. She came empty-handed, and left with a small offering cupped in her palms. And the next night she came back as though the night before had never happened. Hungry for another, I started watching her after she left. The first time I just stood at my window and saw her cross the grass, and I assumed she went inside her own front door, though I didn't actually see it happen. The second time, I made a point of watching, and that's when the unease I'd been swallowing finally lodged in my chest and would not go down. She didn't go to her front door. She walked along the side of her house, past it, toward the back, where the yard gave way to the dark wall of the trees. And she kept going until the night took her. I told myself she was putting something in a shed, or sitting out for air. But I didn't believe it, not really. The next night I didn't go back to bed after she'd gone. I waited a beat, slipped my shoes on, and followed her across the grass. At a distance, my heart going hard, feeling foolish and frightened in equal measure. She walked, slow and certain, around the side of her house and across her weedy back lot to the very edge of the tree line. And there she stopped. She didn't go into the woods. She simply stood at the threshold of them, facing the dark between the trunks, her back to me, and she raised her hands and held the cup of sugar I'd given her out in front of her, lifted slightly, the way you'd present a gift to someone standing just out of sight. She held it there. She didn't move. The woods didn't move. And the longer I watched, the more wrong it all became. The stillness of her, the patience of it. The sense I could not shake that something on the other side of those trees was looking back at her and at me. My voice came out before I could stop it. I called her name. "Miss Lorna?" She turned. She turned slowly. The way a thing turns when it isn't surprised, when it heard you the whole time and simply chose its moment. And the porch light from my own house reached just far enough across the yards to catch her face. It was not her face, or it was but smoothed, the years pressed out of it, the skin too tight and too young, the eyes too dark and too wide, and the smile. The smile was the same soft grandmother's smile she'd worn on my porch with the pie, except it had kept going, stretched too far across that smooth young face, too many teeth in it, and it did not waver, and it did not blink. I don't remember crossing back to my house. I remember being inside, with the door locked and the chain on, standing in my dark kitchen with my hand pressed over my mouth. And I remember the soft, unbothered sound of her shuffling away into the trees. And I remember that she never once stopped smiling. I didn't sleep. In the morning, with the sun up and ordinary, and the birds doing the very thing I'd moved there to learn the names of, I felt the fear loosen enough to think I'd lost my head, that grief and exhaustion had finally cracked something in me. When the postman came up the road, I was waiting at the mailbox, and I asked him, as lightly as I could manage, about the old woman next door, Miss Lorna. He was an older man himself, friendly, and he stopped sorting the mail in his hand and looked at me with an expression. "I'll carry to my grave," he said. "Careful, that there must be some mistake," he said. Miss Lorna had passed 2 winters back. He remembered the week of it, because the ground was so frozen they'd had to wait to bury her. And that the house had sat empty ever since, that nobody had lived in it, that the family upstate couldn't sell it and couldn't bring themselves to deal with it. He asked if I was feeling all right. I told him I was. I don't know why I lied, maybe because the truth had nowhere to go. When he'd driven off, I stood in the road a long time. And then I made myself walk across the grass to her house, the same grass I'd watched her cross a half-dozen midnights. And I knocked on her front door in the broad, clean light of morning. No answer. I hadn't expected one. The house had the dead-eyed look of a place no one tends, paint peeling, gutters choked with leaves, a film of grime over the windows. I went along the side to the kitchen window, the way she always went, and I cupped my hands against the dirty glass and looked in. The kitchen was thick with dust, undisturbed, the air inside it gone gray and still. And on the table in the center of the room was every single thing I had ever given her. The cups of sugar, the flour, the eggs, all of it, heaped up in a great mound that had been sitting there long past spoiling. The flour gone hard and yellow, the sugar clumped and dark, the eggs split and run together into a black ruin, and the whole pile moving, slow and busy, alive with the things that come to feed on rot. Nothing in that room had been touched by human hands in 2 years. But everything I'd handed across my threshold at midnight was there, gathered, waiting, like an account being kept. I moved out before the month was through. I broke the lease and lost my deposit, and didn't argue when the landlord was sore about it. I never told him why. I never told anyone, not the way it really happened, because there's no telling it that doesn't make you sound as though you've come unstrung. I live in a town 3 counties over now, a bigger place, more lights, more noise, more people close enough that I can hear them through the walls, and most nights I'm grateful for the noise. But the knocking still comes. Not every night, but often enough. 3 soft raps at the door, a little after midnight, patient and gentle. And once when I was new here and not yet wise, I made the mistake of going to the door and looking through the peephole, and there was nothing there but the empty hall, and the knocking went on anyway. 3 soft raps while I stood with my eye to the glass and my heart in my throat. I understand now that it followed me, that somewhere along the way, by giving and giving across that midnight threshold, I had answered a question I didn't know was being asked, and I had said yes to something. So I don't answer anymore. I lie still in the dark and I let it knock. 3 raps and a silence, 3 raps and a silence, and I wait for it to give up for the night. And I try not to wonder what's standing out there in the hall, holding out its empty hands, smiling that soft and patient smile, waiting for me to be lonely enough, just once more, to open the door. We rented the Blue House on Hollow Creek Road the summer my son turned 6, And for a few weeks, I really did believe I'd found us a good place to land. I was raising Danny on my own by then, working remote to stretch a single income, and the rent on that house was low enough that I'd been suspicious until I saw it. A tidy two-story with peeling blue paint set back from a gravel road that wound up into the green folds of the Carolina mountains. There was a creek behind it that gave the road its name, and a yard big enough for a boy to wear himself out in. And after the cramped apartment we'd left behind, it felt like room to breathe. Danny took to it the way only a small child can, like the place had been waiting for him. And there were other children next door, which I'd hoped for, 3 of them, close to his age, out in their yard most every day. They were good kids, was my first impression. Almost startlingly so. They were polite in a way that children simply aren't anymore. The oldest girl calling me ma'am, and the 2 boys taking off pretend hats and giving little nods when I came out to call Danny in for supper. They never shouted, never squabbled, never threw the kind of tantrum that's just part of the weather of childhood. They played quiet games in the long grass, ring games and clapping rhymes I half remembered from my own grandmother, and there was something old-fashioned about all of it, about the way they dressed too. The girl in a faded cotton dress that hung past her knees, the boys in buttoned shirts and trousers that looked handed down from some earlier decade. I figured the family was poor, or religious, or just particular about such things, and I was grateful that Danny had company, so I didn't let myself dwell on it. A mother learns to be grateful for whatever keeps her child happy and out from underfoot. The thing that first put a small cold thread of unease through me was the photographs. The landlord had left a few odds and ends behind in the house, and in the bottom drawer of a built-in cabinet, I found a manila envelope of old snapshots, the kind with the rounded corners and the date stamped orange in the margin. Most were unremarkable. A Christmas tree, a man washing a car, a woman squinting into the sun. But 3 or 4 of them showed children playing in the yard next door. And the dates in the margins read 1973, 1974, and the children in those pictures were the same children. The same girl, in the same long cotton dress, the same 2 boys in their buttoned shirts, standing in the same patch of grass, beside the same fence, frozen mid-game. I sat on the floor of that house and looked at those photographs for a long time, and I told myself the obvious thing, the sane thing, that this was a family that had lived in that house for generations, that these were the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the children in the pictures, that mountain families favor each other strongly, that a long dress and a buttoned shirt are not so unusual in a place that holds to the old ways. I told myself all of that, and I put the photographs back in the drawer, and I closed it, and I did not look at them again. But I started watching the children more closely after that, the way you can't help watching a thing once it's snagged on the edge of your mind. I noticed that I never saw them arrive in the yard, and never saw them leave it. They were simply there in the mornings, and simply gone by dark. I never saw a parent. I never heard a screen door bang or a voice call them in. I never saw them eat, never saw a cup of juice or a sandwich crust. And in the heat of a mountain July, they never seemed flushed or sweaty or thirsty, the way Danny always was, the way children are. And once, I'll admit it, I had this strange sensation of looking right at them across the 2 yards, and feeling, for just a moment, that I was looking at a photograph myself, that they were too still, too composed, 3 small figures arranged in the grass. Then the girl turned her head and smiled at me and waved, polite as ever, and the feeling passed, and I went back inside and felt foolish. It was Danny who finally said the thing out loud that I'd been refusing to. He came in one afternoon, sweaty and pink from playing, and sat at the kitchen table while I made him a sandwich. And as I set it down in front of him, he asked me, in that offhand way children ask the questions that stop your heart, why the other kids didn't have to eat. I asked him what he meant. He said that whenever he ate his snacks outside, they didn't have any. They just sat and watched him eat and smiled the whole time. I kept my voice light and asked if maybe they ate inside their own house with their own mom. He shook his head and bit into the sandwich and said, around the bread, that they'd told him they didn't need to. And then he said, the thing I have never been able to put down, not in all the years since. He said they'd told him they'd lived in that yard forever and ever, and that they liked him, and that soon he could live there forever and ever too, and play with them all the time, and never have to go inside, or go to bed, or grow up at all. He said it cheerfully. He thought it was a fine idea. He asked if he could. I don't remember answering him. I remember the kitchen tilting a little, and the bright ordinary sunlight on the counter going somehow thin. And then I remember walking out my back door and across the 2 yards toward the neighbor's house with my heart slamming, meaning to have a word with these people. These parents I had never once laid eyes on about what their children were filling my son's head with. And I crossed into their yard, and I stopped, because the house in front of me was not a house anyone lived in. I had been seeing it every day for weeks out of the corner of my eye, the way you see the familiar furniture of your life without really looking. And I had never once truly looked at it until that moment. The porch was thick with undisturbed dust and drifted leaves. The windows were dark and filmed, and broken in places, patched with cardboard, gone soft and gray with weather. A realtor's sign stood crooked in the front bed, so old the company's phone number had faded. Near to nothing, the whole thing half swallowed by a tangle of weeds that had clearly been growing up through it for years. No one had walked up those porch steps in a very long time. No child had run out that door in the morning, or been called back through it at night, because the door hung an inch ajar on a dark and empty interior. And it had hung that way, I understood with a slow and terrible certainty, the entire time. I went back inside, and I found the realtor's number, the company name still barely legible on that ruined sign, and I called them, and I told the woman, who answered, that I was renting the blue house on Hollow Creek and asking after the empty place next door. There was a pause, and then she told me, in the gentle, lowered voice people use for old griefs, that the house had been vacant for decades and that they'd never been able to sell it. When I pressed her, she told me why. There'd been a fire, she said, back in the 70s, a winter fire that took the whole family in the night, the mother and the father and their 3 children. She said it was a sad piece of local history, that folks didn't like to talk about it, that the property had passed from hand to hand and no one had ever been able to make a thing of it. She asked if everything was all right at my place. I said yes. I hung up the phone, and I stood in the kitchen, and through the window over the sink, I could see the empty yard next door, the long grass moving a little in the evening wind, and no children in it at all. I did not sleep that night, and I am glad I didn't, because near midnight I went to check on Danny, and standing at his window, looking down into the dark, I saw them. The 3 of them were out at the fence line, between the 2 yards, standing in the cold blue wash of the moon, and they were not playing. They were not smiling. They stood in a row, with their faces turned up toward the house, toward Danny's window. 3 pale, still shapes in their old-fashioned clothes, and they were watching my son sleep. The girl's face was tilted up at me, and there was nothing childlike in it now, nothing polite, only a flat and patient waiting, the look of something that has all the time in the world and knows it. I did not scream. I think I had passed somewhere beyond screaming. I went and I woke Danny gently and told him we were going on an adventure, and I packed 2 bags in the dark with my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the zippers, and I carried him out to the car before the sky had even begun to gray. We drove down Hollow Creek Road in the last of the dark, the gravel popping under the tires. And Danny, sleepy and confused but always game for an adventure, knelt up in the back seat to look out the rear window the way he did. And he lifted his hand and waved goodbye, because that's what you do, because he was a sweet boy, and they had been his friends. And I looked in the mirror, I couldn't help it. And I saw the 3 of them standing at the fence in the gray half-light. And I saw them raise their hands and wave back. All 3 at once, slow and exactly together, perfectly in unison, the way no 3 separate children have ever moved in the whole history of the world. They grew smaller in the mirror as the road carried us down and away, smaller and smaller, but they did not turn, and they did not lower their hands, and they did not stop watching us. Not until the trees finally closed over the road behind us and took them from sight. We never went back. I broke the lease over the phone and paid what I had to pay, and had a man I hired box up our things and bring them down to us in the apartment we ended up in, 2 hours south and a world away. Danny doesn't remember much of that summer now. He was 6, and children are kind to themselves that way. But every so often, even now, years later, he'll mention his old friends from the Blue House, the quiet kids who never had to eat or sleep or grow up. And he'll say it with a kind of soft, distant fondness. And once he asked me, frowning, why we ever left when they'd wanted him to stay and play forever. And I never know what to tell him. I just hold him a little tighter than he likes anymore. And I think about 3 children, standing at a fence in the moonlight, waving and waving, waiting in a yard they have never once left. And I am grateful, every single day, that we got out before forever could begin. After my husband's passed, the silence in our old house got so loud, I couldn't bear it anymore. And so at 61 years old, I did something everyone told me was foolish. I sold the place we'd raised our children in and moved alone to a quiet mountain town where the lawns ran big and green and the neighbors were few and far between. I told myself it was a fresh start, though I knew, even then, that you don't start anything fresh at my age so much as you go looking for a place quiet enough to finish out in peace. Harold had been the kind of man who handled things, the cars and the gutters, and the taxes and the lawn, and without him, I felt like a woman who'd had a limb taken, forever reaching for tools that weren't there. The house I bought sat on a wide lot at the end of a road that climbed up toward the national forest, and the yard around it was the biggest I'd ever owned, a sloping expanse of grass that the previous owner had clearly kept like a putting green, and that I had no earthly idea how to manage. The man across the road came over my second day there. His name was Dale, a widower himself, soft-spoken and stooped, somewhere in his 70s, and he had that gentle mountain courtliness that I'd already begun to love about the place. He saw me out there staring helplessly at the old riding mower the previous owner had left in the shed, and he came over and showed me how to start it. And then, seeing how I struggled with the thing, he offered to help me keep the yard up until I got the hang of it. I was grateful past telling. I'd been dreading that grass, dreading the way it would grow up around the house and make it look abandoned, make it look like exactly what it was, a place where a widow had gone to be alone. Dale was a godsend those first weeks. He'd come over a couple times a week in the cool of the morning and run the mower around while I made us both iced tea, and we'd sit on the porch after and talk about our lost spouses, and it was the closest thing to comfort I'd felt in a long while. But I want to be clear about this, because it matters to everything that came after. I never once asked that man to come at night. The first time I heard the engine in the dark, I was sure I was dreaming. It was deep summer by then, the windows open, to catch what little breeze came down off the mountain, and I came swimming up out of sleep around 2 in the morning to the unmistakable drone of a mower working back and forth across my yard. I lay there a while telling myself it was a dream or a neighbor's late chore drifting on the air, but it didn't stop and it didn't move off, it just kept on. That steady mechanical back and forth right outside my window. Finally, I got up and went to the glass and looked out, and I saw the mower moving across my front yard in the pitch dark. No headlamp, no flashlight, no moon to speak of that night, just a man-shaped dimness behind the machine, pushing it in long, perfectly straight lines down the slope, and back, down, and back, mowing my lawn in the dead of night, by no light at all. I told myself it was Dale, that the old man had insomnia, that grief did strange things to a person's sleep. Lord knew it had wrecked mine. But something kept me from going out there. Some animal part of me that was older and wiser than my manners pinned me to that window. And I just watched, and after a while, I made myself go back to bed, and I did not sleep. In the morning, the grass was cut. Not just cut, immaculate, the lines razor straight and even, edged neat as a magazine picture, finer work than Dale had ever done in the daylight. And there was Dale himself out on his porch across the road with his coffee. And when he saw me, he lifted his hand and waved, easy and ordinary, like any morning. I went over. I thanked him for the yard, told him he really shouldn't trouble himself at such an hour, that I'd worried about him out there in the dark. And he looked at me with the most honest confusion I have ever seen on a man's face. He swore to me he'd been asleep, that he hadn't touched my yard in days, that he'd never in his life mowed a lawn at 2 in the morning, and wouldn't know why a soul would. He wasn't lying. I've been married long enough to know a man's true face from his put-on one. And Dale was genuinely baffled, and a little worried about me, I think. The way you worry about someone who's started seeing things. I let it go. I walked back across the road with my skin gone cold in the warm morning, looking at that beautiful, terrible, perfect lawn. It kept on after that. Not every night, but often, always after midnight. Always that same steady engine working back and forth in the dark. I stopped going to the window most nights. I'd just lie there in the dark and listen to my lawn being mowed by something that worked without light. And in the mornings, the grass would be flawless. And I told no one, because who do you tell a thing like that? My children would have put me in a home. Dale already half thought I was losing my grip. So I kept it to myself, and I lived alongside it, the way I suppose people in those mountains have always lived, alongside things they can't explain. But it gnawed at me, the not knowing, until finally I did the only practical thing I could think of. My son had given me one of those little security cameras the Christmas before, the kind you stick up by the door. And I'd never bothered to set it up. I dug it out, and I mounted it on the porch post, angled out across the front yard, and I waited. It was 3 nights before the engine came again. I lay rigid in my bed listening to it the whole while, maybe an hour of that steady droning back and forth, and I did not get up, and I did not look. In the morning, with the sun well up and the coffee made, and my courage as gathered as it was going to get, I sat down with that little camera, and I played back what it had caught. And I have not had a peaceful night since. The footage was dim and grainy, lit only by the faint glow off the porch, but it was clear enough. There was the mower, my mower, moving across the yard in those long straight lines, down the slope and back, exactly as I'd heard it. But there was no one pushing it. The handle was empty. The machine moved on its own through the dark, turning at the end of each row neat as you please, the grass falling behind it, and not a living hand anywhere near it. And at the edge of the yard, back near the tree line, where the dark was thickest, there was a shape. A man's shape, tall and still, standing with its arms down at its sides, not moving, not ever moving, in all the long minutes I watched. Just standing there at the boundary of the light, watching the mower do its work. Watching it the way a foreman watches a job he can no longer do himself. I asked around town after that. Carefully the way you do, working it into other conversation so as not to seem mad. It was an old woman at the church, one of those who've been in a place so long they hold all its history in their heads, who finally told me what I think I already knew. She asked which house I'd bought, and when I told her, her face changed and she got quiet, and then she told me about the man who'd owned it before. He'd been a proud man, she said, proud to a fault, the kind who couldn't abide an untidy yard, who took it as a personal failing if a single weed got ahead of him. He'd kept that lawn like a shrine for 30 years, and he'd died out in it, she said, on a hot July night, mid-mow. His heart had simply quit on him while he worked, and he'd gone down out there in the grass in the dark, and not been found until morning. The mower run out of gas beside him, a single uncut strip left at the edge of the yard where he'd been headed when he fell. She said it real gentle, watching my face. She said, "He never did get to finish that night, honey." And I understood then. I understood it better than I wanted to. I sold the mower the very next week, hauled it down to the consignment lot in town, and let a stranger cart it off for less than it was worth, just to have it gone from my shed and my life. And it worked, after a fashion. The nights went quiet. The grass began to grow up around the house, unchecked, getting long and ragged and wild, the way I dreaded when I first arrived, and I found I didn't care anymore, that I'd rather have a wild yard in my sleep than a perfect one and that company. But it isn't fully over, and I don't believe it ever will be, not while I'm in that house. Some nights, in the small hours, I still hear it, not the smooth, steady drone of before. The mower's gone, after all. What I hear now is worse. It's the sputter and catch of an engine trying and failing to turn over, again and again, far off and then closer, the sound of something searching the dark yard for the machine that isn't there anymore, looking for the work it was never allowed to finish. And on the worst nights I'll lie there and I'll hear, under the sputtering, the soft swish of grass being pushed through, slow, back and forth, by no engine at all. I don't get up to look. I've seen all I ever need to see. I just lie still in the dark and wait for the proud, patient thing out there in my long, wild grass to give up for the night, knowing that it won't. Not really, not ever, because some men can't rest until the lawn is done, and that lawn will never, ever be done again. I live alone in a holler outside a town, so small it doesn't show up on most maps. The kind of place you only find, if you already know it's there, where the road turns to gravel and then to dirt, and then to a pair of ruts, running up between two ridges, so close together, the sun doesn't reach the bottom till nearly noon. I came out here on purpose, after a life that had gotten too loud and too crowded with people who'd let me down. And for a long while, the solitude was exactly the medicine I'd hoped it would be. Just me and my old hound dog Bess, and the sound of the creek and the wind moving through all that timber. My closest neighbor was a man named Gerald, who lived in a single wide trailer up on the far ridge, maybe a half-mile through the woods, or a mile and a half by the road. He was a quiet man, older than me, a widower I'd heard, and we suited each other fine by hardly speaking at all. We'd lift a hand to each other if we passed on the road, And that was about the whole of our neighborliness, and we both seemed to prefer it that way. Two men who'd come up into the hills to be left alone, leaving each other alone. The trouble started with Bess. She was a good dog, steady, not given to barking at shadows the way some dogs are. But along about the middle of that autumn, she took to standing at the edge of the yard, where it dropped off into the trees between my place and Gerald's, and barking. Not her usual barking. This was a low, uncertain sound, her hackles up and her tail tucked, backing away even as she barked, the way a dog does at a thing it doesn't understand and doesn't like. She'd do it at dusk mostly, facing into those woods, and I'd call her in, and she'd come gladly, gladder than usual, pressing up against my leg once she got inside. I figured it was a bear or a bobcat, something moving through that had her spooked, and I didn't think a great deal of it. Out here you learn to share the dark with the animals. Then came the evening I heard my own voice calling from the trees. I was standing on my porch with a cup of coffee, the light going blue and soft the way it does in the hollers, and Bess was down at the tree line, doing her low frightened barking, and out of the woods, clear as anything, I heard myself call her. "Here, girl, here, Bess." My own voice, my exact voice, the particular way I say her name, the little rising note I put on the here out of long habit. It came from down in the trees, 40 or 50 yards off in the dark, and I felt every hair on my body stand up at once, because my mouth was shut, and the coffee cup was halfway to my lips, and I had not made a sound. And Bess heard it too, and to her it was me calling, her master's voice telling her to come, and she stopped her barking, and her tail came up, and she trotted right down into those trees toward the sound of me. I called after her, my real voice this time, cracking, and she didn't come back. Not that night, not ever. I stood out on that porch with the flashlight till my arm went numb, calling her name into the dark, and the only thing that ever answered was a far-off rustle, and once, much later, very softly, the sound of my own voice somewhere deep in the timber, calling her name back to me, gentle and patient, long after I'd gone hoarse and given up. I didn't sleep right for a long while after losing Bess, and maybe that's why I was slow to understand what was happening to me, because it didn't stop with that one night. Over the following weeks, I kept hearing myself out in those woods. I'd be inside with the windows shut, and I'd hear my own laugh drift down off the ridge, my real laugh, the one I hardly ever use anymore, living alone. I'd hear myself humming the old tunes I hum when I'm working around the place, the same ones, in the same flat way I hum them. And worse than that, far worse, I started hearing the woods repeat things I had only ever said inside my own house, alone with no one to hear. A thing I'd muttered over the dishes, a thing I'd said out loud to Bess's empty bed in a weak moment one bad night. The trees gave it all back to me in my own voice, out there in the dark, like something was sitting in my walls, learning the shape of me, and then carrying it off into the timber to practice. I got it into my head that it was Gerald. It was the only thing that made any sense a man could hold on to. I figured he'd put some kind of recorder in my house, or aimed some listening device at it from his ridge, and was playing my own voice back at me through the woods, out of spite or madness, the way a lonely man up here can go bad in the head. I worked myself into a fury over it, across about 3 days, and then I walked the 1.5 miles of road up to his trailer to have it out with him. I beat on his door ready to threaten him, and when he opened it, I saw at once that I had it all wrong. The man was gaunt and gray and hollow-eyed, like he hadn't slept in a month, and when I started in on him about my voice in the woods, he went white as ash and put his hand on the doorframe to hold himself up, and he told me in a shaking voice that he'd been hearing his own voice too. For months, he said, longer than me, coming up out of those same woods between our places, calling to him, laughing, saying things he'd only said when he was alone. He thought it had been me doing it to him. We stood there on his rotting little porch, the two of us, and we worked out between us that neither one of us was doing a thing. That there was something down in the timber between our two houses that had been listening to us both, learning us both, stealing our voices off the air, and stitching them into something it could use to call us out into the dark. After that, we got friendlier than we'd ever been, Gerald and me, out of pure shared terror. We'd sit on one or the other's porch in the evenings and compare what we'd heard, trying to make some sense of it, trying to find the edges of the thing. He told me about his wife then, finally. Maddie, her name was. She'd passed 2 winters back, right there in the trailer, and he'd never gotten over it, never even started to. Just sat up there on his ridge with her empty chair and her clothes still in the closet. He told me he'd started hearing her voice in the woods lately, not just his own anymore. Hers, calling him by the pet name only she had ever used for him. A name he swore he'd never said aloud to a living soul since she died. He'd get this look when he talked about it, this terrible mixture of horror and hope. And I'd tell him, "You know that's not her, Gerald. You know that's the thing doing what it does." And he'd nod and say he knew it. But I could see in his eyes that some part of him didn't want it to not be her. That some part of him, after 2 years of that empty chair, would walk into anything at all if it called him by that name. I lost track of Gerald for a few days that next week, which wasn't so unusual, but something nagged at me, and finally I walked up to his trailer. The door was standing open. His coffee was still in the pot, gone cold and skinned over. His boots were by the door, and his truck was in the yard, and his bed hadn't been slept in. And down at the edge of his yard, where it fell off into the woods toward my place, the leaves were all scuffed and disturbed. A single trail of them pushed through, leading down into the dark timber. I never saw Gerald again. I called the county, and a deputy came out 3 days later and walked around and wrote some things on a clipboard, and said the man had probably just wandered off, that it happened with old folks living alone, that they'd keep an eye out. They never found him. Not a boot, not a bone, not a scrap of cloth. He just walked down off his ridge into those woods one night, following a voice he wanted to believe was his dead wife's, and the holler closed over him like water over a stone. I should have left then, I know that. Anyone hearing this would say, "Why in God's name did you stay?" And the only answer I have is that this is my home, the last home I'll ever have, and I am too old and too stubborn and too alone to start again somewhere new. And besides, I have come to understand that the thing in the woods is patient, and I am not sure anymore that leaving would put any real distance between us. So I stay. I keep the windows shut and locked even in the heat. I keep a radio going in the evenings, turned up loud, country music, or the preachers, or just static, anything to fill the house with sound that is not the sound of the woods, because the voice still comes. Most nights now. My own voice, drifting down off the ridge in the blue dark, sweet and familiar and warm, calling to me the way I used to call to Bess, calling me to come on out, come on down, it's all right, come and see, and I'll tell you the truth. On the lonely nights, it is the hardest thing in this world not to answer it, because it sounds so exactly like me, like the part of me that misses my dog and misses poor Gerald and is so tired of being alone in this holler at the end of the world. It is nearly perfect, that voice. It has had a long time to practice, but it makes one mistake every single time, the same mistake that has kept me alive this long, and that I pray to God it never learns to stop making. When it calls me, it always says my name one time too many. It calls it, and then it pauses, and then it calls it again, soft and coaxing, in that voice that is almost but not quite my own. And no man alive has ever once, standing alone in the dark, called out his own name twice. The town we moved to sat in a fold of the Blue Ridge, so deep and so far from anywhere that the cell signal gave out a good 10 miles before you reached it, and it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the woman at the post office knew your business before you did, and the men at the feed store could trace your new neighbors back 4 generations. My wife Janelle had taken a teaching job at the little school there, and we'd bought a modest 2-story on a quiet lane at the edge of town for less than we'd have paid for a parking space back in the city, and we told ourselves and our daughter Emma that this was the good kind of small, the safe kind, the kind of place where a 7-year-old could ride her bike to the end of the road and back without her parents' hearts climbing into their throats. And it was, in most ways. The people were warm. They brought us food. They learned our names. Which is exactly what made the empty house beside ours so strange. Because in a town where everyone knew everything about everybody, nobody would tell us a single thing about the house next door. It was a tall old place, narrow and dark, set close to ours on the side, where Emma's bedroom was. No one lived there. The neighbors all agreed on that much, when they'd say anything at all. It had been empty for years, they said. The yard was overgrown, the paint gone gray and peeling, the windows dark and dead-looking. And yet every single evening, at precisely the same minute as the dusk came down, the porch light came on. A warm yellow glow over that sagging front porch, switching on as regular as if a hand inside had thrown the switch, and every morning, at the first gray of dawn, it went dark again. I noticed it our 3rd or 4th night there, and I pointed it out to Janelle, and we puzzled over it, the way you'd puzzle over any small mystery, figuring some relative kept the power on, or it was on a timer, or a caretaker came by. But there was never a car, never a light in any window but that one, never a soul on that porch. Just the light, faithful as a heartbeat, coming on at dusk and dying at dawn. I started asking around, the way a curious man does. I asked the fellow who ran the hardware store, and he got real interested, all of a sudden, in the receipt he was writing. I asked the woman next door on the other side, a kindly widow named Mrs. Combs, who'd brought us a pie, and her face just closed up like a flower at dusk. And she said she didn't rightly know anything about that house, and changed the subject to the weather. I asked the man who delivered our propane. Same thing, lowered eyes, a mumble, a quick turn to some other topic. It's a particular thing, the way small-town folks go quiet when you've stumbled onto something they all know and have all agreed not to speak of. It isn't rudeness. It's closer to fear, or to grief, or to some old wound the whole town has silently decided to leave alone. I learned to stop asking, but I didn't stop watching that light. It was about 3 weeks in that I first saw the figure. I'd gotten up in the night for water, and passing the upstairs hall window that looked out toward the other house, I glanced over the way you do, and I stopped cold. There was a man standing at the upstairs window of the empty house, the window directly across from ours. Directly across, I realized with a slow, sick turn of my stomach, from Emma's bedroom. He was just a dark shape behind the dusty glass, tall and still, and he was not looking at me. He was looking down and to the side, down into the dark window of my daughter's room, and he did not move at all the whole time. I stood there with my heart going like a hammer. I went and checked on Emma. She was sound asleep, her nightlight glowing, the picture of safety. When I came back to the hall window, the figure was gone. But that porch light was burning away down below, steady and yellow and patient. I called the sheriff the next day. He was an older man, Sheriff Pruitt, with the unhurried way of someone who's policed the same few hundred people his whole life. He came out, polite enough, and he walked the property of the empty house with me, and we found exactly what you'd expect to find at a house abandoned for years. A locked front door, thick with dust, windows you could barely see through for the grime, a back porch with the boards rotting through. And then Pruitt told me the thing that I have never been able to fit comfortably in my mind since. He told me the house had no working electricity. Hadn't. For years, he said. The power company had cut it long ago when the place went empty and the bills went unpaid. And the lines coming to the house were dead. And there was no generator, no solar, nothing. The porch light, he said, looking at me steady, simply could not be on. And yet we both turned, the two of us, in the gray light of that afternoon, and we looked at that porch, and even in the daylight you could see it. The bulb behind its dusty glass globe, glowing faint but unmistakable, burning current it had no possible way to draw. Pruitt looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked away, and he told me he'd keep an eye on things, and he got in his cruiser and left a good deal quicker than he'd come. After that, the figure came more often. I'd see it 2, 3 nights a week, always at that upstairs window, always looking down into Emma's room, always perfectly motionless. I didn't tell Janelle the worst of it, because I didn't want to frighten her, and I half thought I might be losing my grip, except that then Emma started to change. She began sleepwalking, which she had never done in her life. The first time, Janelle found her at the top of the stairs in the dark, just standing there, her eyes open but empty, facing the window toward the other house. We led her back to bed, and she remembered nothing, but it kept on, and it got worse, and twice, I woke in the night to find the front door standing open, and my little girl outside in her nightgown in the dark, halfway across the 2 yards, walking toward that empty house. The second time, I caught her, with her small hand already laid flat against its weathered front door. And when I scooped her up, she stirred and murmured, still mostly asleep, that the man wanted to show her something. I carried her back inside, shaking so hard I could barely hold her. And I sat up the rest of that night in a chair against the front door, and the porch light next door burned all night long, and I swear to you, I could feel it watching us through the wall. It was Mrs. Combs, who finally broke and told me the truth, the old widow from the other side. I think she'd seen me getting frantic, seen the dark circles under my eyes, and her conscience got the better of the town's silence. She had me sit on her porch one afternoon, while Emma was at a friend's, and she told me, low and reluctant, about the man who'd lived in that house. He'd been a decent man once, she said, years and years back, with a wife and a little girl of his own. And the little girl had taken a fever one hard winter, the kind that used to carry children off before there was much to be done about it, and she died in that house, in that upstairs room, the very room with the window. The wife left not long after, couldn't bear the place, but the man stayed, and he was never right again. He spent the rest of his years, Mrs. Combs said, watching the children of the town. Just watching them. He got it into his head that his daughter's spirit hadn't gone on, that it was still here somewhere, that it had passed into one of the town's children, and he was forever watching them, trying to figure out which one carried his little girl, which one he could call home. The town had tolerated him out of pity, kept their children clear of him, and waited him out. And he had died, finally alone, in that upstairs room where his daughter had died, looking out that window. And the porch light, Mrs. Combs said, dropping her voice so low I had to lean in. The porch light had come on by itself the very night he passed, and it had been coming on every night since, and no one in that town had ever found a way to make it stop, and so they had simply learned to never speak of it. We moved before the summer was out. I won't pretend there was any noble struggle to it, any attempt to stay and see the thing through. I had a daughter walking toward that house in her sleep, with her hand reaching for the door, and there is no mystery on this earth I value over my child, and so we packed up, and we broke the lease, and we left all in the space of about 10 days, the neighbors watching us go, with that same lowered-eyed silence they'd met all my questions with. And here is the thing I have never told anyone but my wife, the thing that sits coldest in me. The night we pulled out of that lane for the last time, our headlights swinging across the front of the empty house as we turned. The porch light went out, not flickered, went out, full and final, the way a thing goes out when it's done, when whatever kept it burning has finally let go, and it did not come back on. I've checked in the cowardly way you check such things. I called Mrs. Combs a year later, under some pretext, and worked it into the conversation. And she went quiet and then told me the porch light had never come on again. Not once, since the night we drove away. Emma is older now, and mostly she remembers nothing of that summer, the way children mercifully forget. But every now and again, even still, years on and 3 states away, she'll mention him. The nice man, she calls him. The nice man who used to wave to her from the window of the house next door. She says it fondly, like a happy memory, like something warm from a good childhood. She says he had a kind face, and he was always glad to see her, and he used to wave to her at bedtime through the glass. And I never know what to say, because we never told her any of it, and because as far as I ever saw across that whole terrible summer, the figure at that window never once moved, never once lifted a hand, never once did anything at all, but stand there in the dark and look down into my little girl's room. So I don't know what she saw that I didn't. I don't know what waved to her on all those nights I wasn't watching. I only know that whatever it was, it had been waiting a very long time for a child to wave back, and that it finally let its light go out, the night we took her away. When the company transferred me to manage their distribution operation in a little town, tucked deep in the Appalachian foothills, my wife Renee and I told ourselves it was the kind of fresh start most families only dream about. We had 2 kids, a mortgage we were tired of, and a city life that had worn thin, and the town offered a big old house on a quiet street for a price that seemed almost too good to question. So we didn't question it. We loaded up the moving truck and drove down into those green hills, the road narrowing, and the trees crowding closer the deeper we went. And by the time we pulled onto our new street, I had that good full feeling in my chest that a man gets when he believes he's done right by his family. The welcome we got only deepened it. We hadn't been parked an hour before the neighbors started coming, a steady stream of them, smiling, shaking my hand, pressing casseroles and pies and jars of preserves into Renee's arms, welcoming us to the town with a warmth I'd never known a place could offer. Back in the city, you could live somewhere 10 years and not learn your neighbor's name. Here they knew ours before the truck was unloaded. The Hatfields, who lived in the big house right next door, were the warmest of all. Vernon Hatfield and his wife Dell, an older couple, gracious and grandparently, and they would not hear of us cooking on our first night in a strange kitchen. They insisted, absolutely insisted, that we come to supper at their place, and we were too tired and too charmed to refuse. It was a fine meal, I'll give them that, a real country spread, and the Hatfields could not have been more hospitable. But looking back on it now, from the far side of everything that came after, I can see the things I let slide that night because I wanted so badly for this to be the good place I'd promised my family it would be. The way they watched us eat, not in any friendly way, watched us, Vernon and Dell both, their eyes moving over my children, over Renee, over me, the way a man at a stockyard watches animals come off a truck, and the questions. They kept asking, gentle and smiling, whether we had family who'd be coming to visit. How many of us there were, all told. Whether anyone back home would think to come looking. If we ever decided to just stay on and put down roots. The questions had a kind of hunger underneath the sweetness of them, a patience I couldn't name, and I answered them all. Honestly, the way a polite guest does. And only later did I understand. I'd been telling them exactly the things you'd want to know about, a thing you meant to keep. For the first week or two, the warmth held its shape, and we were happy. Then it began to curdle, so slowly that I kept finding ways to explain it. We started coming home to find our front door unlocked when I was sure I'd locked it. Then we started coming home to find neighbors inside our house. Not breaking in, nothing so crude as that. They'd just be there, sitting in our living room, smiling. And when we came in startled, they'd say they'd just stopped by to check on us, to see how we were settling in, and wasn't it a fine thing to have neighbors who cared. Dell Hatfield was in our kitchen one afternoon, when Renee got home from the store, just standing at the counter, and she explained that she'd noticed. Our curtains were drawn and wanted to make sure all was well. They never seemed to think there was a thing wrong with it. And they knew things. They knew my work schedule down to the minute. Knew which nights Renee had her book she liked to read late. Knew the children's bedtimes. Knew which one of our kids was the early riser. Once Vernon asked after my sister by name. My sister back in the city, who I would have sworn on my life I had never once mentioned to a soul in that town. When I asked how he knew her name, he just smiled and said, "Oh, it must have come up," and changed the subject, and the back of my neck went cold, in a way it never quite warmed up from again. Renee felt it before I'd let myself admit it. She started keeping the doors locked and the curtains shut, started flinching when a neighbor waved, started sleeping poorly. The children grew quiet and clinging in a way they hadn't been, even in the upheaval of the move. And I finally sat down with my wife one night after the kids were asleep, and we said the thing out loud to each other that we'd both been carrying alone, that there was something wrong with this town, something underneath all the casseroles and the handshakes, and that we did not want to stay. We decided we'd start quietly looking into moving back to the city, that I'd talk to the company about a transfer back. I made the mistake the very next day of mentioning it to Vernon Hatfield. I don't even know why I told him. Force of neighborly habit, I suppose, the same instinct they'd been feeding all those weeks. I just said, casual as I could make it, that we'd been thinking the country life might not suit us after all, that we might head on back to the city before too long. Vernon's face didn't change much. He just nodded slow and looked at me a moment with those patient eyes and said, "Now I don't believe you want to do that." Soft, almost kind, and went back inside his house. The next day the whole street was different. Not a single neighbor waved. No casseroles, no pies, no smiling visits. As I walked to my car that morning, the silence on that street was a physical thing, thick and total. And as I walked, I saw the curtains twitch in window after window, the whole length of the road, the fabric shifting as I passed, eyes behind every one of them, tracking me to my car and back, and not one soul came out, and not one voice said good morning. It was worse than any threat anyone could have spoken. That whole long day the town just watched and waited, and the warmth they'd buried us in for weeks was simply gone. peeled back to show the thing that had been underneath it the entire time. That night, I understood how much trouble we were in. After dark, Renee called me to the front window in a voice I'd never heard her use, and I looked out and saw that every house on our street had turned its porch light on and aimed it toward our house. I don't know how else to say it. The lights weren't just on. They were turned, angled, pointed at us. The whole street lit up and focused on our home like the eyes of something that had finally stopped pretending. They burned all night long. None of us slept. And, sometime in the small hours, Renee found a note that had been slid under our front door. A single sheet of paper folded once, and on it, in a careful old-fashioned hand, were just 5 words. You belong to the town now. We didn't wait for morning. We didn't pack much. A bag of clothes apiece. The children carried sleeping straight from their beds to the back seat. The photographs and the keepsakes, and most of what we owned left behind in that house, where I suppose it sits to this day. I backed the car out of the driveway in the dark with my headlights off. At first, some animal instinct telling me not to announce it. And we started down that street toward the road out of town. And I will carry what I saw on that drive until the day I die. They were all out. Every neighbor on that road, standing in their own front yards in the dead of night, in their night clothes and their work clothes, and their Sunday best, motionless, silent, lined up along both sides of the street, and they all turned their heads slowly to watch us pass. The Hatfields stood at the end of their drive, Vernon and Dell side by side, and they didn't try to stop us, didn't shout, didn't move at all, except to follow us with their eyes. Rows and rows of people standing dead still in the moonlight, watching my family flee. Not one of them lifting a hand, not one of them making a sound, until we reached the edge of town, and the dark trees swallowed the road behind us, and I drove like a man with the devil at his back, until the sun came up, and we hit the interstate, and I finally let myself believe we'd gotten out. We never went back. I never even arranged to have our things sent. The thought of anyone connected to that town, knowing where we'd landed, was more than I could bear, and we started over with nothing and counted ourselves lucky to have it. I told the company I'd take any posting on Earth, but that one, and I never explained why, and I think some part of the man I talked to already knew not to ask. In the years since I have tried, in the cold light of an ordinary life, to make sense of what we were caught up in, I've wondered if it was some kind of cult, some closed and inbred old mountain faith with notions about strangers and belonging that the rest of the world left behind a century ago. That's the explanation I reach for when I want to sleep. But it never quite holds, because it doesn't account for the things they knew, the names they couldn't have known, the way the whole town moved as one thing with one will. I still don't know what they wanted from us, what it would have meant to truly belong to that town, what would have happened to my family if we'd stayed 1 week or 1 day longer. I only know one thing for certain, the thing I learned later, piecing it together from old news the way you pick at a wound. That house had been a bargain because it kept coming open. Families moved into it the way we did, welcomed and fed and folded in. And the records showed them living there a while, and then the records just stopped. No forwarding address, no sale, no trace. The family simply gone from every account, as though they dissolved into the hills. The town had welcomed others before us, many others, with casseroles and handshakes and suppers on the first night. And not one of those families that I could ever find, anywhere, ever seemed to leave. I moved back to my hometown, in the hills of eastern Kentucky, to care for my mother in what we both knew would be her final years. And though I dreaded the leaving of my own life to do it, There was a sweetness in those months I wouldn't trade for anything now. Mama was failing slow, her heart and her lungs both giving out by degrees, and I'd left my job and my apartment in the city to come sit with her, in the little house she'd lived in for 50 years. The house I'd grown up in, at the end of a winding road where the holler closed in green and close on every side. It was lonely country, the nearest town a good 20 minutes off, but Mama had one constant in her life out there, and that was her neighbor Ruth. Ruth lived in the only other house within sight, just up the road, and she and Mama had been friends for more decades than I'd been alive. When I came home to nurse my mother, Ruth was already a fixture, stopping by most every day with a pot of soup or a loaf of bread, or just herself and a deck of cards, and I came to lean on her something terrible those long months. She'd sit with Mama so I could rest. She knew where everything was, knew Mama's medicines, knew her moods. I thanked God for her more than once. Mama passed in the early spring, quiet, in her own bed, with me holding one hand and Ruth holding the other. And I'll admit I was grateful in my grief to have Ruth there, someone who'd loved her as long as I had and longer. The funeral was small. The holler folk came and went. And then it was just me alone in that house full of my mother's things, sorting through 50 years of a life, trying to decide what to do with myself now that the thing I'd come home to do was finished. I figured I'd stay a few weeks to settle the estate, and then go on back to the city and try to pick up the threads of my own life. I figured Ruth's visits would taper off. Now that Mama was gone, that we'd drift apart the way people do when the thing that joined them is no longer there. I figured wrong on every count, because Ruth's visits didn't stop. They got more frequent, not less, where she'd come once a day before. Now she came 2 and 3 times. And where she used to knock, now she'd just let herself in, the way she had when Mama was alive and bedridden and couldn't get to the door. I told myself she was grieving, that she was lonely, that 2 old friends had been parted, and the one left behind was clinging to the house where the other had been. I understood it, or thought I did, but it started to wear on me the constancy of her, and worse than the constancy was the way she began to sit. She took to sitting in Mama's chair. Not just any seat, Mama's chair, the worn green recliner by the window that had been my mother's throne for 30 years, that no one else had ever sat in, that I myself couldn't bring myself to sit in. Ruth would settle into it like it was hers, and she'd get this peaceful, settled look, and she started using Mama's expressions. Little turns of phrase that were Mama's, and only Mama's, sayings I hadn't heard from another mouth in my life, and she started humming. Mama had a way of humming the old hymns, slightly off-key, always flatting the same notes, and I had loved and been driven half mad by that humming my whole childhood. And now, here was Ruth in Mama's chair, humming those same hymns flat in those same exact places. And the first time I heard it, the hair stood up on my arms, before my mind even caught up to why. The night everything turned, I'd gone up to bed and woken in the small hours with a powerful thirst, and I came down the dark stairs toward the kitchen for a glass of water. There was a figure standing in the dark kitchen. My heart near stopped, and then I saw it was Ruth. Ruth, in the middle of the night, in my mother's house, standing at the counter with her back to me. And she was wearing my mother's housecoat. The faded blue quilted housecoat that had hung on the back of Mama's bedroom door, that Ruth had no business touching, that I'd been meaning to give away. She had it on, and she was swaying, just slightly, side to side, the way Mama used to sway when she stood at that counter working her bread dough. I said Ruth's name, and she turned around, slow, and for one moment, impossible, marrow-deep moment that I have never been free of since. It was not Ruth's face that turned to me in the dark. It was my mother's. The same eyes, the same lines around them, the same sad, tired, loving smile I'd watched fade off a deathbed not 2 months before. It hung there in the dimness for the space of a breath, my mother's face on Ruth's body, and then it sort of shifted and settled, like water finding its level, back into Ruth's own plain features. "I just miss her so," she whispered. "But here is the thing I cannot get past, the thing that sends me cold all over even now, in the safe middle of an ordinary day." It was not Ruth's voice that said it. It was Mama's, my mother's voice, coming out of Ruth's mouth, low and grieving in the dark kitchen. "I just miss her so. I should have run that night. Lord knows I see that now. But grief makes you slow and stupid, and some part of me, some weak and aching part, did not entirely want to run from a voice that sounded so much like my mother's. So I stayed. And over the following weeks, I watched Ruth become something I have no words for. She stopped answering to her own name. I'd say Ruth, and she'd look at me blank, but I caught myself once saying, "Mama," without thinking, "the way you do," and she turned to me bright and warm, and answered to it like it had always been hers. She started knowing things Ruth could not have known. Private things, family things, secrets from deep in my childhood that I had never told a living soul but my mother. The name of a doll I'd buried in the yard at 6 and cried over, a shameful thing I'd done at 12 that Mama and I had agreed never to speak of. Again, the pet name Mama called me only when we were alone, that no one else on earth had ever heard. Ruth knew them all. She'd bring them up gentle and fond, the way Mama would have. Sitting in Mama's chair, in Mama's housecoat, smiling Mama's smile, and the house that had been my whole comfort became a place I could hardly stand to be inside. I finally found the nerve to end it on a gray afternoon, when the thing wearing Ruth was sitting in that green chair humming flat. I told it, that she needed to stop coming, that she needed to stay in her own house and leave me be, that I couldn't do this anymore. And the face that had been Ruth's turned to me, and it smiled, my mother's exact smile, soft and patient and a little hurt, and in my mother's voice it said, "But honey, where else would I go?" Just that. Where else would I go? And it kept smiling, and it didn't move from the chair, and I understood with a cold and total certainty that whatever was in my house, it did not consider itself a visitor, and it did not intend to leave. I drove into town that same day and had a locksmith come out and change every lock on the house, the doors front and back, even the latches on the windows, and I felt half a fool doing it, and half like I was fighting for my life, and I couldn't have told you which feeling was the true one. That night, I lay in my old childhood bed, with the new keys under my pillow and the new locks shot home on every door, and the house sealed up tight as I could make it. And sometime, past midnight, I woke to humming. Coming up the stairwell from the dark kitchen below, that same off-key hymn, flatting on the same notes my mother always flatted, drifting up soft and slow through the locked and silent house. I lay there rigid in the dark with my heart going, and I listened to it hum. And I did not get up. I want to be clear about that, because it is the one thing I did right, and the one thing that let me keep my mind. I did not go down those stairs to see who was humming in my locked kitchen in the dead of night. I lay there till the first gray light came in the window, and the humming finally stopped. And then I rose, and I packed a single bag, and I walked out the front door and got in my car, and I drove away from that house, and I never once went back. I left it all to her, to Ruth, or to whatever it is that wears Ruth now, or wore my mother before her. I've never been sure which way it runs, whether Ruth loved my mother so long and so hard that she let her in, or whether the thing that came for Mama simply moved next door into a body that loved her. the way a flame steps from one candle to the next. I left the house in Mama's chair and Mama's housecoat, and the whole holler to it. And I signed away what little claim I had through a lawyer in town, without ever setting foot inside again. My people back home think I'm cold for it, abandoning my mother's home, her things, my inheritance, all of it left to rot, or to a neighbor who was kind to her. They don't know. I've never tried to make them understand, because there's no understanding to be had, only the cold knowing I carry. Some inheritances aren't worth the claiming, and some neighbors, the good ones, the faithful ones who sit by your dying and hold your hand at the very end. Some of them love the dead a little too well and a little too long, until grief stops being a feeling and becomes a kind of hunger, and they find a way, God help them, to keep the ones they can't let go of. I hope Ruth is at peace. I hope my mother is. I just couldn't stay in that house long enough to learn which one of them was humming. Old Mr. Pruitt lived on the ridge beside us, and for the first stretch of time after my wife and I bought our place, up there he was, about the best neighbor a man could ask for, which is to say, he kept to himself and waved when waving was called for and didn't trouble us about much of anything. Our two properties ran together along the spine of the ridge, divided by a crooked old split-rail fence, the kind they don't build anymore, gray and leakened and leaning, that had clearly stood there longer than either of our houses. On our side, the land was open pasture sloping up to the house. On Pruitt's side, past the fence, it fell away into deep timber, old-growth woods that went down into a dark holler and on, as far as I could ever tell, into country that nobody owned and nobody walked. I didn't think much about the fence at first. It was just the line between his land and ours, sagging and half-rotted, and one of the first projects I had in mind that summer was to clear the brush and the briars that had grown up thick along the whole length of it, tidy the boundary up, maybe replace some of the worst rails. It seemed a neighborly thing even, to offer to do his side too. So I mentioned it to him one afternoon when we'd both ended up at the fence at the same time. I said, I was planning to clear the brush along the line, and would he mind if I worked his side as well while I was at it? And the change that came over that old man was a thing I have never forgotten. The friendly, easy set of his face just dropped away, and something underneath it came up, something tight and gray and frightened, and he reached across that fence and gripped my forearm with a strength I'd never have credited to a man his age. He looked me dead in the eye, and he told me, slow and serious, leaving spaces between the words, so I'd be sure to take them in, that I was to leave that fence be, that I was never, under any circumstances, to cross it after dark. Not for any reason at all, he said. Not for any sound I might hear coming from the other side. I want you to promise me, he said, and his fingers dug into my arm. You do not cross that fence at night, no matter what calls you. I laughed. God forgive me, I laughed. Because what else does a sensible man do when his elderly neighbor grabs him by the arm and starts talking like that? I made some joke about bears and pulled my arm free easy and told him not to worry himself. He didn't laugh. He just looked at me a long moment with those frightened gray eyes, and then he turned and walked back to his house, and he did not look back. I gave up on the brush clearing, not out of fear, I'll be honest, but because the old man had clearly taken it so hard that I didn't want to start a feud with the only neighbor I had. And for a while, things went quiet. But I started noticing Pruitt out at that fence at night. I'd be up late, or get up for water, and look out toward the ridge line, and there he'd be in the moonlight, a thin shape moving slow along his side of the fence, pacing it, end to end, like a sentry walking a wall. And he was talking. I couldn't hear the words, just the low murmur of his voice drifting across the pasture, and he wasn't talking to himself, not the way a lonesome old man mutters. He was talking to the woods, facing into that dark timber on his side, and speaking low and steady to it, the way you'd speak to settle a spooked animal or a child waking from a nightmare. And some mornings I'd see, down at the base of a particular tree just past the fence on his side, a huge old oak, far bigger and older than anything else in those woods, its trunk gone black with age. I'd see plates, white china plates set down in the leaf litter at the foot of that oak, and on them food, real food, meat and bread, like offerings left on a grave. By afternoon they'd be empty and gone, and Pruitt would be back to set out more at dusk. I'd half made up my mind the old man had simply lost his reason, the way they sometimes do out here, alone too long with the quiet. And then the sound started on my side of the fence. It began small, a scratching, late at night, low down along the base of the house, the sound of something dragging its nails slow across the foundation stones. Then, some nights later, weeping, soft, broken weeping, that seemed to come from just past the pasture's edge, down where my open land met the dark. And it had the particular sound of a child crying, that high, hopeless, heartbroken sound that goes straight through a person. The first night I heard it, I came near to going out, thinking some lost child had wandered up the ridge, and only the lateness and the dark and some cold knot of warning in my gut kept me inside. And then the voice started forming words. A little child's voice, thin and pleading, asking to come inside, asking, just past the edge of the light, in the smallest, saddest voice you ever heard, "Please, it's so cold, please let me come inside." Night after night it came, and it learned, I think, what worked on me, because it got more pitiful, more desperate, more exactly like the voice of a real and freezing and frightened child left out in the dark. There came a night the voice was so pitiful, I couldn't bear it anymore. Some animal part of my mercy overrode every warning, and I went out the door in my nightclothes and started down across the wet pasture toward the fence, toward that small, crying voice, asking to come in from the cold, and I had got maybe halfway when I heard Pruitt. He came off his porch screaming, the old man, running flat out across his own yard in his nightshirt with his white hair wild, screaming at me to stop, to get back in the house. He came over that fence faster than I'd have thought he could move, and he grabbed me, the same iron grip on my arm, and he hauled me bodily back up the slope toward my house, putting himself between me and the dark and dragging me along, and I was so stunned I didn't fight him. And as he pulled me away, the weeping behind us changed. The child's voice, that pitiful, pleading little voice, broke off all at once, and what came up out of it in its place was not a child. It was a low, wet, delighted sound, a laughing that climbed and rolled, and did not belong to anything that had ever been a person, and it came not from the ground, but from up high, from the branches, and I heard it move, heard it go back through the treetops away from us, laughing into the deep timber on the far side of the fence. Pruitt didn't let go of me till we were on my porch with the door shut and bolted behind us, and we stood there in my front room, the two of us breathing hard, neither one of us saying a word for a long time. When he finally talked, he talked all night, exhausted, gray-faced, like a man emptying out something he'd carried alone too long. He told me the fence wasn't a property line. It had never been a property line. The founding families of that part of the ridge had set it there generations back, and the line it marked was far older than any deed, a boundary they'd drawn to keep something in the deep woods on its own side. He didn't have a name for the thing, or wouldn't say it if he did. He just called it what was down there, or the thing in the oak, and he told me that for as long as anyone in those families could remember, Somebody on this side had taken on the keeping of it. The setting out of food, the speaking to it low at night, the watching of the fence. As long as it was fed, he said, as long as it was tended and spoken to, and kept content on its side, it stayed on its side. But it was always reaching across, always calling. It learned the voices of children, because a crying child is the one sound a decent person cannot ignore. And the only thing the fence and the offerings really did was keep it patient. The one rule, the rule that mattered above all others, was that you did not cross to it, and you did not let it call you across. Because the fence only held from this side. It couldn't come over, but anything that went over to it was gone. Pruitt's own father had kept it before him, and his father before that. And now Pruitt was old and tired and afraid, and he looked at me that night, across my front room, with something I only later understood was a kind of terrible hope. And he said he was glad, in the end, that I'd come to live on the ridge. Pruitt died that winter. They found him in his bed, gone peaceful enough, by all accounts, an old man's heart, simply stopping in the night. There was no family to come. No one took over his place. No one knew what I knew, and I couldn't tell a soul without sounding mad. And I'll confess I was a coward about it those first weeks, telling myself the old man had been crazy after all, that I'd been swept up in a frightened night and a strange story. I didn't set out any plates. I didn't walk the fence. I didn't speak to the dark. And for a little while, through the dead of that winter, it was quiet, and I let myself believe. It's not quiet now. The scratching came back first, low along the foundation in the small hours. Then the weeping, soft and far off at the edge of the pasture, and it has grown louder every week since, bolder, closer, no longer content to stay down at the tree line. The plates at the base of the oak sit empty and cracked, and nobody fills them. And the thing has learned something new this winter. Something Pruitt never warned me of. Maybe because it never tried it on him. Maybe because it saves it for the keeper who won't keep. It has stopped crying like a child. Lately, in the deep middle of the night, the voice that comes up out of the dark past the fence is calling me by my name. My own name, soft and patient and almost kind, the way you'd call a friend up onto the porch, over and over, all through the small hours, from just the other side of that crooked old fence. I keep the doors bolted, and I don't go to the windows. And I tell myself every morning that tomorrow I'll start setting out the plates. That tomorrow I'll learn to keep it the way Pruitt did, the way his father did. But I'm so tired now. Tired, the way Pruitt looked that last winter, and the voice is so gentle when it says my name, and it sounds so much like it only wants to come in out of the cold, and I am running out of reasons, night by night by night, not to answer it. We bought the house in a little mountain town, in the dead months of winter, when the price was low, and our patience for our cramped city apartment was lower, and we moved in on a gray, cold day with a rented truck and more boxes than two people have any business owning. The house was old but sound, a two-story clapboard, at the edge of town where the streetlights gave out and the dark woods began. And by the time my wife Carrie and I had hauled the last of it inside and shoved enough aside to clear a path to the bed, we were past exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired where you fall asleep before you've finished deciding to. We didn't even properly make the bed. We just dropped onto the bare mattress in our clothes sometime after midnight and were gone to the world. And I remember thinking, in the last clear moment before sleep took me, that we'd done it, we'd finally gotten our fresh start, and that this quiet little town was going to be good to us. The knock came at 3 in the morning. I know it was 3 because the first thing I did, swimming up confused out of that dead sleep, was look at my phone on the floor beside the mattress, and it read 3 exactly. The knock came again while I was staring at it. 3 slow, firm raps on the front door downstairs. And my first muddled thought was that something was wrong, an emergency, that nobody knocks on your door at 3 in the morning otherwise. I went down in my sock feet, my heart going a little, and I opened the front door, and there on the porch in the dark stood 4 people. 4 of them close together, smiling at me. 3 women and 1 man, all of them old, dressed in a plain old-fashioned way I couldn't quite place. The women in long dark dresses, and the man in suspenders and a buttoned collar. And the oldest of the women, a tall, thin one in front, was holding out a woven basket toward me with both hands. "Welcome wagon," she said, and smiled wider. The basket was full of bread, dark loaves, and little glass jars of preserves that caught what light there was. I want to tell you I slammed the door, that some instinct warned me, but the truth is, I was so exhausted and so thoroughly bewildered that I just stood there, and good manners took over the way they do. And I thanked them, and I took the basket from her hands. It was warm. The bread was warm, like it had just come from an oven on a freezing night at 3 in the morning. I should have felt how wrong that was. I think some part of me did feel it, but I was too tired to let it surface. And then the strange thing, the thing that finally started the cold, creeping up my spine, even through the fog of sleep. They didn't leave. I thanked them and stood holding the basket, expecting them to wish me well and go. And they just stayed there on the porch, all 4 of them, and their smiles stayed fixed, and their eyes went past me, past my shoulder, into the dark hallway of the house behind me. All 4 pairs of eyes looking past me into the house, with a kind of patient, hungry attention, like they were taking inventory of something inside. It went on too long. It went on long enough that the hair came up on my arms, and then Carrie's voice came down the stairs, sleepy and alarmed, calling out to ask who it was. And at the sound of her voice, the 4 of them, all together, turned their eyes from the house back to me, and the old woman gave a little nod, and they turned and walked off the porch. I stood in the doorway and watched them go, and that's the detail that stayed lodged in me hardest. They didn't walk toward any of the houses on our street. They walked straight out across the dark yard, away from the road, away from every house I could see, toward the black tree line at the edge of town. And the dark took them, 4 old figures, walking single file into woods, where there was no house and no road, and no reason on God's earth for anyone to go at 3 in the morning. I told myself, in the morning it had been a dream, or near enough, some confusion of exhaustion, and a real but ordinary visit. But the basket was on the kitchen counter where I'd set it down. Real as anything. The bread real. The preserves real. Sitting there in the daylight to prove it had happened. I mentioned it at work that first day. I'd taken a job at the lumber yard in town. And at lunch, I told one of the older fellows there, half laughing, about our peculiar welcome wagon at 3 in the morning. I was making a funny story of it. He stopped chewing. He set his sandwich down slow and asked me to describe them. And I did, the 4 of them, the old-fashioned clothes, the tall, thin woman in front with the basket. And the color went right out of his face. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he told me, quiet, not looking at me, that the 4 people I'd described had run the town's general store back in the 1940s. 2 sisters, the husband of one of them, and their old mother. And that they had all 4 died together the night the store burned to the ground with them inside it, more than 70 years ago. He told me he wasn't joking, and he wished to God he were. He told me that the house we'd bought had a history to it, that the welcome wagon came to every new family that moved in, always at 3 in the morning, always with the basket. And he told me, finally getting up from the table, because he didn't want to say anymore that the families who took the basket never seemed to last long in that house. We should have left right then. I've turned that over 1,000 times since. We had the truck still. We hadn't even unpacked. We could have loaded back up and driven out of that town and eaten the loss and counted ourselves lucky. But you don't, do you? You don't uproot your whole life on the word of a superstitious old man at a lunch table. Carrie didn't fully believe me when I told her, and I half didn't believe it myself in the bright ordinary daylight, and we had nowhere else to go, and every dollar we had sunk into that house. So we stayed. And the knocking came again the next night at 3, and the next, and every night after. 3 slow raps on the front door at exactly 3 in the morning. I stopped answering it after the second night. I'd lie there rigid beside Carrie and listen to those 3 patient knocks, and then silence, and in the morning there'd be a fresh basket sitting on the porch. And the baskets changed. They got fuller. More bread, more jars. And after a while other things, a jar of honey, a comb of it, a dark cake, a clutch of brown eggs. The basket heaped higher every single night, as if whatever was leaving it was coaxing us, sweetening the offer, the way you'd build up a trail of feed to lead an animal somewhere it didn't want to go. And the few times in those weeks I weakened and went to the window. When the knock came, they'd be down on the dark lawn, all 4, looking up at the house, and their smiles were wider every time. Wider than a face should go. I threw the baskets out. Everyone, straight into the trash, and I told Carrie not to touch a thing they left, and for a while she didn't. But it wore on her in a way it didn't wear on me. The constancy of it, the 3 a.m., knocking night after night with no sleep, and I think, too, that the house itself was working on her, the way an old house can get its hooks in a person. She got pale and quiet and strange around the edges. And one morning I came down and found her at the kitchen counter, eating the bread. A loaf from that night's basket, torn open, and she was eating it slow, with a faraway, peaceful look on her face. And when I shouted and knocked it out of her hands, she looked at me like she didn't quite know me, like she was surfacing from somewhere deep. And she said she didn't know why I was making such a fuss, that it was only bread, that it was good, that it tasted like home. She's different now. It's been a few weeks, and she's not the woman I married anymore. Not all the way. She's quieter, colder. She doesn't laugh, and her eyes have gone flat and patient. And sometimes I catch her, looking at me past my shoulder, into the house, the same way they looked past me that first night. She stopped minding the knocking. She sleeps right through it now, or she doesn't sleep at all. I can't always tell which. And last night I woke at 3 to the bed empty beside me, and I came out into the hall and found her standing at the front window in the dark, in her nightgown, perfectly still, smiling out at the black yard and the tree line beyond. And in her hands she was holding a basket, her own basket, woven like theirs, and I hadn't bought it, and I'd never seen it before. And it was full of bread, dark loaves, warm. I could smell them from across the room, and little jars that caught the moonlight. She didn't turn when I said her name. She just kept smiling out at the dark, holding that basket against herself, waiting, and I understood then, cold all the way through, what she was waiting for. She's waiting the way they waited. She's part of it now, part of whatever lives in that tree line, and comes knocking at 3 in the morning. And she's standing at the window with her welcome basket ready, looking out at the empty street, waiting for the next family to move into town. And God help me, I'm still here. I'm still in the house. Because I can't bring myself to leave her like this, and I can't make her come away. And every night now, at 3 o'clock there's a knock at the door. And lately I've noticed it isn't coming from outside anymore. It's coming from inside the house. from downstairs. From the kitchen, where my wife stands all night long with her basket, smiling, knocking, patient, waiting for me to finally come down and answer.